gentleman, and a very good friend. Rafael is the director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. And it is through his thoughtful consideration of the very hardworking people of Butte that he said this collection must come to Butte and be here for a good length of time. He recognized that W.A. Clark would never have afforded this collection without our ancestors' sweat and blood. So it is wonderful to have Rafael here and to have the art here. And it is important that we have this here and have no fee, so that people can come in and enjoy this. And that is at the graciousness of the Humanities Montana and my friends, the Friends of the Butte Archives, which is can't go anywhere without your friends. So Rafael, since 2019, has been the Bruce and Suzanne Crocker Director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. Dr. Chacon is also a professor of art history and criticism in the School of Visual and Media Arts at the University of Montana. He has taught a range of courses on art history and criticism for the last 25 years. He holds a BA in art from Wabash College and received his master's and his PhD degrees in art histories with honors from the University of Chicago. Just prior to the start of the coronavirus pandemic, the Smithsonian Institute named him one of the top 10 lecturers in their global travel program. Rafael will speak to us this evening on a question of taste, Senator William Clark's art collection. Rafael.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks to all of you for showing up on a blustery summer day. I just want to clear the air a little bit. The fact that this collection is here is not due to me. It's due to an amazing partnership with Ellen Crane. So let's have a round of applause. And also for this amazing staff and the friends and all the people who've worked so hard to bring this work back to this town. So thank you very much. So thank you everybody. Just a little heads up for those of you guys who are over there sort of bunched up around the door. This is going to be a kind of strange lecture because I'm not going to lecture from the podium up here. I'm actually going to walk around the room. So some of you will have to crane your necks, and so I want to invite everybody who's at the door. There's a couple seats, at least there's one here, and there's a couple benches here. Anybody can have this tall bench if you want this. There's another one here, but grab a seat where you can, and just try to stay away from leaning up against the paintings. So. It is indeed a pleasure to be back in Butte, and so thanks to all of you for showing up tonight. I came in from Missoula, horrific storm, rain, wind, I mean, you name it. I got grappled on the way into the building. It was like, oh gosh, that hurt. But you guys are Butte tough, so you're here, so thank you. We have this wonderful opportunity to look at some great art and to talk about William Clark. So it should be a kind of a delicious feast for us tonight. So, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start in the very back of the room. So just turn around, crane your necks, because obviously the story starts with this guy that you see here, the guy with the whiskers, right? So this is Senator William A. Clark, and obviously is somebody who's very well known in this town. And he did indeed make his fortune here. So in some ways, we wouldn't be in this room if it weren't for him. I mean, we wouldn't be talking about this amazing collection. So this is the important person. The important date is 1878, which is when he began to seriously collect art. And Ellen and I were just talking earlier about how William Clark deserves kind of reevaluation, because for most of the 20th century and into the 21st century, he's been painted as this corrupt politician, this mogul, cutthroat Butte mogul, right, who exploited all these people, right, made these fabulous fortunes, outrageous fortune in his day, and with somewhat of a shady conscience, if any conscience at all, right? So, but it seems that history, that he deserves actually to be reevaluated, not just as a politician, as a personality, as a great senator, but as a human being, as in his totality. And this collection, in some ways, is very much a part of that story, because he was as active in the collection as he was in raping and pillaging. No, excuse me. He was, in fact, very serious about art and very serious about collecting. Now, part of the problem with the legacy of William Clark is that he's always compared to people like J.P. Morgan or Henry Frick, those great collectors, the Astor family in New York City. And he compared himself against those other moguls. I mean, there is, in fact, not a modicum of jealousy in the way that he approached collecting art. He wanted to be respected by the upper echelons of New York and American society, and maybe even European society as well, and could never quite break through that kind of barrier that existed there. He was no J.P. Morgan. He was no Henry Frick. And in fact, his approach to collecting was very different from theirs as well. And that's one of the things I want to address tonight. How is it that his collection came into being, and how is it in fact different from the fabulous collections of somebody like Frick? And by the way, Henry Frick is one of my heroes, and if you've ever been to New York City, that's a museum you must not miss, the Frick collection, because it is in fact a comparable collection, but so different in many regards. William Clark would not be very happy that we're here tonight. Okay, in fact, he'd be quite upset that we're all here looking at his art, because this is not what he intended at all. He did not want his art to be in public collections sort of scattered around the country, as fortunately is what's happened. And let me just tell you a little bit about the work that you're seeing here. There are, in fact, 7 paintings here. And the University of Montana, well, the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, the institution that I represent, received 9 of William Clark's collection. There are 2 that are not on view, and I'll tell you about those in a minute here. But we have only a very, very small portion of what are about close to 1,000 paintings and sculptures that belong to William Clark. Most of those things have lived most of their life in the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which is now closed. And in a couple of years ago, the collection was dispersed when the Corcoran closed its doors. That collection went mostly to museums. Actually, most of them went to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And then about 30% of them were distributed to museums and universities in the Washington, D.C. area. The University of Montana is the only institution outside of the D.C. area to receive any work from the William Clark collection. So again, Clark would not be very happy about that, because his intent was always that the collection upon his death, which happened in 1925, that the collection would stay together. Sort of like Henry Frick's collection is together, or J.P. Morgan's collection is together in its own museum. He actually intended this collection to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which at that point in 1925 was considered one of the great world museums, like the Louvre in Paris, or the National Gallery in London, or the Prado in Madrid. He wanted the Met to have his collection, because he felt that that was the upper echelon of the art world. And that didn't happen. He wanted, in fact, the art to stay in his home at 962 Fifth Avenue. This was one of the most ostentatious mansions on Fifth Avenue. He built this thing and lived in it for only 13 years. And he housed his collection in 5 galleries in that house. And actually his preference was that the art stay in that house. The Met turned him down. And we really don't know why the Met turned him down. It could have been just pure snobbery, because the people like the Astors controlled the board there, and they were not about to let William Clark into that club, that elite club. But they might have turned him down for a couple of reasons. One was the collection was considered second tier. So compared to the things that they had at the Met, and compared to the collections of the other New York City moguls or Washington, D.C. moguls or whatever, they didn't consider his collection to be of top quality. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that they weren't about to take on this boondoggle of a house. I mean, they were actually about centralizing collections into that building on Fifth Avenue, that amazing building on Fifth Avenue. So, and he wanted it to stay together. He wanted it to stay in this house. So maybe it was just that practically it didn't work out. But regardless, what happened is that upon his death, the work could not go to the Met because they rejected it. And so the family actually left it to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which was definitely a notch below the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There's no question about it. And so the collection has sort of languished in some ways in this second-tier American museum. By the way, the Corcoran was a fabulous museum, if any of you ever visited it. It was a marvelous place. But in sort of in the pecking order of museums across the country, it's not the Met, right? So, unfortunately, the collection was sort of mostly in storage, but what was on view was in this other institution. Again, Clark wouldn't have been happy about that. But the collection now, I think now that it's been dispersed, a couple of things may happen, and I hope happens. The institutions that now have these works from William Clark have a chance to reevaluate those objects and do the scholarship and the research and the documentation that has never been done by the Corcoran. And I think that what's going to happen is, and we certainly will set about doing that at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, and I think what's going to happen is all kinds of amazing things will show up in this collection. And it'll in fact help us reevaluate William Clark as a collector, as a good eye, as somebody who was very interested in culture and very interested in European history and very interested in art. So before I actually start talking about the works that are here, I want to talk about the works that are not here. So there's two pieces. One is a painting by Kahn, which was the artist who did that painting over there in the far corner. And the reason why we didn't bring that here is because it has some conservation issues. It's also huge, and it's in a frame, a gilded frame that weighs like about a ton. So there was just the logistics of moving that thing from Missoula to Butte. So we left that, the Kazan, and we felt that the painting that's here is actually equally beautiful, and so Kazan is well represented. The other thing we did not bring is a piece that's attributed to Donato di Beto, also known as Donatello. You guys heard about Donatello, the Ninja Turtle? Remember that? So there is a marvelous piece. It's a Madonna and Child, and it's a relief sculpture. It has a kind of arched top to it, and it's about so big. It also weighs close to a ton, and it's actually it's a relief sculpture in plaster and wood and all kinds of different materials. And it's attributed to the great Renaissance artist Donatello, who was one of the predecessors of Michelangelo, a well-known and well-respected artist. In a few years, we're going to be doing a symposium on Donatello at the university and bringing the scholars from around the world on Donatello to tell us, in fact, whether this is Donatello or not, and if it isn't, what is it? It's a remarkable piece. It's a beautiful piece, and we hope to have that on view in our new facility very shortly. So anyway, so those two, and that piece, by the way, is so fragile it will never move from Missoula anywhere. I mean, it really should not have traveled in a truck all the way from D.C. to Missoula 2 years ago. So anyway. So those are the two pieces that are not here. The rest are representative, I think a fair representation of the kinds of things that William Clark collected and the kinds of things that were on view in the house. By the way, I don't know if you've read the biography of Huguette Clark, the daughter of William Clark. It's Bill Dedman and Newell were the two authors, Newell and Dedman. And I understand that Bill Dedman will be back to talk to you, so I hope you make that lecture. But anyway, they tell us that in the biography that William Clark actually was so proud of his collection. So he was not at all, he did not think he had a second-rate collection. In fact, he was actually very proud of the collection. So proud that he actually opened up the house on Saturday morning or Saturday afternoons for people to actually come and visit for a very small fee. So you could actually visit the house, and you would enter through this gateway here, and then you would experience the galleries. And this is a wonderful reproduction of what one of the galleries, the main hall, looked like. And in fact, Dedman and Newell tell us that that people came to see the art, yes, but really they came to see that organ, or to hear that organ, because they often played it on Saturdays when visitors were in the visiting the collection. But as you can see, it was a beautiful classical room with marble walls hung with drapes, and then with these incredible paintings. And already you can see some very impressive paintings. There's some Dutch paintings. He owned Rembrandts, and he owned Rubens. But the majority of the paintings were French. And that's because Clark, his heritage was French, and he really wanted to collect French art. About 1,000, close to 1,000 paintings and sculptures, and then who knows, countless thousands of decorative arts were also in his collection, many of which were French. So we're talking pots and pans, porcelains, all kinds of stuff, miniatures. And that stuff has also been dispersed recently by the Corcoran. Okay, so sorry, Mr. Clark, for turning my back on you, but thank you for the works. Okay, so let's talk about the collections, and we'll talk about the individual works of art. So I'm intentionally starting at the back of the room because the oldest works are actually here. So we have a painting here by Jean-Honoré Fragonard, and then over there we have Thomas Gainsborough. So we have a French painting and an English painter right there, that little one that you see there. And I have to double check the names because all these French artists are Jean-Baptiste, Jean somebody. So yeah, this is Jean-Baptiste, Camille Corot. They're all Jean something. But anyway, this is Jean-Honoré Fragonard. And these two paintings, as humble as they may seem, are actually quite important works of art. And it tells you, in some ways, the kind of quality that Clark was looking for. By the way, in terms of collecting strategies, by 1878, by the time he got started, it was a little late to be doing the choice paintings. So, for example, Frick got started a decade earlier, and Frick was very systematic, as was J.B. Morgan and others, very systematic about getting that Titian, the right Titian, or the right El Greco, or the right Rembrandt. And sometimes they waited until people died to pounce on that work of art on the estate, and then they obviously had the money to do it. The strategy that Clark used was a little bit different. It was more like casting the net wide and having agents out there looking for things, and basically hauling as much stuff back as you could, and then culling that to a certain degree. We don't know exactly the process that William Clark used, but that seems to have been the approach. By the time that he got into the business of collecting European masters, the Titians were sewn up, the Rembrandts were sewn up, the Rubens were sewn up. So there are choice examples of the great European masters in his collection. But really, the strength of his collection is French art, because he really pursued it, doggedly pursued it, or he had his agents pursue it. So most of this collection is, in fact, great French art. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a great thing, because 19th century France was it for the visual arts. Paris was the center of the art world in the 19th century. So to be collecting French art in the 19th century and to amass a sizable but qualitatively good collection of French art was no small task. And by the way, if we're going to do the comparison thing, I always think, okay, it's not fair to compare him to Henry Frick, but let's compare him to Marcus Daly. I mean, Marcus Daly comes off as a Philistine compared to William Clark. William Clark is like a genteel, refined, erudite, right, collector. So what he achieved was actually pretty remarkable. To amass a great collection of French art in the 19th century was actually quite a remarkable thing. So we start with the French painting here, and this is the work of Fragonard. Fragonard was a court painter, meaning that he worked for the French court, and this is the court. This is the court that literally lost its head in the French Revolution. So it's the court of Louis XVI. And Fragonard was one of the top painters in that court. We don't know if the king actually saw this painting, but more than likely he did. There's, by the way, a second version of this painting in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So both of these were done by Fragonard. Fragonard, by the way, was the favorite painter of the king's mistress, Madame Dupree. So who knows if this painting actually passed through those hands as well. But it's an interesting painting. It shows us it's called The Happy Family. And what you see here is, in fact, a mother holding a baby, sort of like a Madonna and child theme. It's a group of very happy, very well-fed French peasants. So, of course, that's interesting that the court, the highest echelon of aristocracy in France, the monarchy, would actually collect images of peasants. Well, if they're going to collect images of peasants, their peasants are going to be happy, healthy, robust, well-fed, rosy-cheeked babies, right? Those little French babies look like you could just bounce them around, right? But what does that tell us about William Clark? His peasants are also happy and well-fed and robust. So, anyway, so it's a wonderful painting. Alludes a little bit to the Holy Family, although it's actually it's what the French call a genre painting. It's just a painting of people doing their normal things. But notice that there's no evidence of poverty or revolution or what's coming, beheadings or guillotines. This is actually the kind of image that an aristocrat would like to cultivate, an image of the court. So a very important piece by Fragonard. Roughly contemporary is the little painting that you see here. And so I'm going to shift over to the right. And this little work was done by Thomas Gainsborough. And you might have heard that name before. Thomas Gainsborough is a very important English painter. Again, a painter identified with the upper echelon of the highest levels of English society. In fact, it worked predominantly for the monarchy and the aristocracy in London, in this case. Thomas Gainsborough was one of the founders of the Royal Academy. So the academies were set up in Europe starting in the 15th century so that the elites could actually concentrate the knowledge, hire the best artists to teach the best pupils, and then those same aristocrats could then buy and have ready access to the best work in the country. The French Academy preceded the London Academy by 150 years. So the British were catching up at the end of the 18th century, trying to be like the French. And Gainsborough was one of the founding fathers of the French Academy, one of the first leaders of the British Academy, not the French Academy. And what's unusual and wonderful about this painting is that Gainsborough was primarily a portraitist. He did portraits of the king, the queen, the consort, whatever, members of the court. And his landscapes are fewer in number, and they're considered much more precious and rarer, obviously. And this painting, when it was looked at by some delegations from the Tate or the National Gallery in London, they raved about this little painting in Clark's collection because it's typical of the kinds of work that Gainsborough probably did for himself, for his own pleasure, his own delectation. So it shows us, it's called a market cart, and it literally shows there's a horse and rider here, the rider's seated on the ground, and there you see a cart on the right fording a stream. It's a kind of very simple little painting from the late 18th century in the Baroque style. So think about these two paintings as both coming out of an aristocratic context, but dealing with the lower classes, sort of the slumming, sort of hanging out with the peasantry. So pictures of peasants doing what peasants do, fording a stream, taking a pause from their daily labors. So another interesting little painting, and a wonderful little painting that Clark collected. Okay, so there are a lot fewer numbers of paintings by Dutchmen or Englishmen or Italians in the Clark collection. Predominantly what we have are paintings by French artists. So I'm going to go around to where Ellen is standing, and we're going to talk about that very large painting over there. Okay, So this is the work of Jules Dupree. And this is one of the larger paintings. There's another Kazan that's a little bit about the same size as this one that's not on view right now. And this work by Dupree, actually, when it was on our list of paintings because by the way, the Corcoran allowed us to make selections, and they sent us a list of about 300 works of art, and they said, choose whatever you want from this. It was like, wow, it's like Christmas, and we chose, I think, close to 40 works, and we got 9. Lucky us. But this was one of the ones that we chose. And but when it arrived and we uncrated this thing, it was like da 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 da. I mean, it was horrible. I mean, I was so depressed because the painting looked like that. First of all, it was like chocolate. It was just goop. The whole thing was brown and dark. You could barely make out what was in the foreground. It had pieces of tape. Can you see that? Little squares. Thank you, Vanna. Little squares of tape holding the pigments together. There were gaps, missing pieces in the painting. And again, it was mostly mud. We couldn't really see what was there. We knew about the painting because it had been well documented. It was in all the paperwork as an important work by an important artist from the earlier half of the 19th century. But the actual painting when it arrived was just a mess. And by the way, the frame that originally came with it was like this wide, about a foot wide, and it projected about a foot. And it also weighed like 3 tons. So we took it out of its original frame. This is a fake frame, by the way. This is a modern frame. We had it restored. So what you're seeing here is a painting that has been very delicately restored, cleaned of all of that old varnish. And all kinds of beautiful things showed up, like for example, all these flowers that are bloom here. In fact, you can actually see the water in the stream. And what it shows, this is a very simple scene. It's a horse and rider and a group of cattle moving across, fording a river in this case. So it's a similar theme as the Gainsborough. Dupree, why is Dupree an important artist? Well, he is considered a realist painter. So realism was the major art movement of mid-19th century France, but he's also considered a predecessor to the Impressionists. So remember, the Impressionists began to paint au plein air, out of doors, and that movement, rather than doing a picture in your studio or sketching outside and then going back to the studio and painting in the studio, painters in France Parisian painters began to go outside into the countryside and actually paint out of doors. Au plein air is what the French call it. And Dupree is one of those first artists to do that. So he's considered an important artist to take painting out of the studio into the out of doors. So more than likely this was started outside and then finished in the studio. He was affiliated with a school known as the Barbizon School. And Barbizon is the immediate predecessors to the Impressionists. So let me just tell you a little bit about why Impressionism is so important and why the Barbizon School is so important as the predecessor to it. If you poll the average American today and you ask them, what's your favorite art style? They will list Impressionism, whether they know what it is or not. Okay? Everybody seems to have seen a haystack by Claude Monet, right? That's what we all identify with Impressionism. But it was a very, very rich and widespread movement. It's that kind of image where, like, if you're looking close at the painting, everything is blurred, and all you see is like paint. You definitely get this light effect, and then when you step back 10 or 20 feet, then it coheres into something that looks quasi-realistic. The Impressionists, in fact, they were derided because they weren't painting pictures like this. They were simply giving us impressions. They were tracking light changes. They were tracking, how atmospheric conditions change from moment to moment to moment. And they did it with aplomb. People like Monet and Degas, I mean, there's a whole slew of the Impressionists. Their predecessors were people like this. And Clark has had a few Impressionists in his collection, but by the time he started collecting Impressionism, people from Chicago had bought them all up. I mean, think about it. Why were people from Chicago or Pittsburgh or Baltimore buying Impressionist paintings? Well, because that was the avant-garde. That was the cutting edge. That was the sexiest new stuff in France after 1875. Clark wasn't so much interested in the sexiness of Impressionism, but he loved the predecessors. And so the strength of the Clark collection is this Barbizon school. It's these realist artists who were in fact the predecessors who began to take those early steps into painting outside, watching the light conditions change. You know, the French Academy required an art student to paint 3 pictures, 3 landscapes in order to graduate. One was a picture in full sun, one was a picture at night, and one was a picture in the rain. If you couldn't master those 3 conditions, right, you failed the painting program. But think about how many conditions one can paint between daytime, full sun, and nighttime. 1 million times a day that one can paint, right? Or between a full sunny day and a rainy day or a snowy day. And it was actually left to a group like the Impressionists or the Barbizon school before them to actually do that. Literally begin to explore the landscape and explore all kinds of weather conditions. This is not exactly a sunny day, is it? It's kind of like a day like today, right? Cloudy skies, brooding clouds in the distance. And it's that interest in this changing atmospherics that preoccupied these Barbizon painters. They were all Parisians, but they would leave the city to go out every weekend or sometimes during the week to paint scenes like this. And again, they're painting low subjects. They're painting common subjects. They're not painting gods and goddesses cavorting in the woods. They're painting the things that they see out there in the world around them. So it's a very, very important work representing a very important movement, which leads to an even more important movement. Okay, so this is the work of Jules Dupree. There is, among this school, this Barbizon school, there's one towering figure that is in all the textbooks, and this is an artist who William Clark adored. And so much so that he collected 23 paintings, 23 pure landscapes by this artist, and 28 paintings that are called genre, so pictures of peasants in a landscape. So he had, close to 50 or over 50 paintings by this artist. And that artist is the artist you see here. This is Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, C-O-R-O-T, Corot. And we have this painting, we have that painting over there, and where's the third one? The third one is over here. One of the things that Clark did, which was very smart, was to hire a good dealer and a good scout. And the Corots were all found by, most of them were found by a man by the name of Joseph Duveen. And Duveen was a kingmaker in the art world in 19th century America. He worked in New York, worked in DC, worked in our big cities, and he was paid handsomely for his opinion. And he also was able to find and locate great paintings. So most of these actually came from Duveen on his recommendation. So the fact that they were in William Clark's collection means that somebody, an expert, was out there finding the works for him. I think they're great paintings. They have been questioned, over the last centuries. Some scholars say that they're not good Corots or they're not Corots at all. But regardless, they were found by Duveen. And if that's true, then these are good works. So there's 3 of them here. One of them is worth over $1 million, and I won't tell you which one it is. we have to have security measures all around us, right? So, and the reason why it's worth so much, and the other 2 are less worth less, substantial. I mean, you could build a house in Montana with selling one of these paintings, but the reason why one of the 3 is so valuable is because it has provenance, meaning that it has a record going to the Corcoran, to Mr. Clark, to a duchess in France, and then it goes back to the studio of the artist. And you have that kind of linkage, that kind of documentation, and you know that the work, I mean, yes, all these works, most of these works are signed, but the fact that you can actually, that you have documents that verify that this has it's been owned by these people, and it goes back to the studio of the artist, that makes it an important work. Okay? Besides the aesthetic properties of the work, right? Because these are indeed beautiful paintings. Just like Dupree, Corot was interested in painting outdoors, painting in locations in and around Paris, in and around Fontainebleau, which is where the Barbizon School was centered. So most of these are landscapes. They're wispy. That's a good term. They're wispy. They're airy and light, and there's a kind of, yes, these artists are all realists, but you can tell this is not photographic. It's intended to be atmospheric. It's intended to create more of a mood than to actually show you, oh, that's exactly what this tree looked like, or what these peasants looked like. So they are, in fact, the predecessor to the Impressionists, and Corot is one of the best. By the way, Duveen also said at one point that, and I think it's Duveen who said this, that Corot painted about 800 landscapes, and that American millionaires were so crazy for Corot that they owned 1,100 of those 800. So there are a lot of Corot wannabes out there. Anyway, so 3 Corots in the collection, and I think we were lucky to get them as part of this sort of suite of works from the Clark collection. They really do represent his love and his interest, and so it's nice to have 3 of those. And by the way, we have at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, we have prints made by Corot. So now we can actually exhibit paintings and prints together. And you can see that he was also an active printmaker as well as a painter in oil. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here by talking about this last painting. And you really should spend a little time with this one, because it really is an amazing work. This is the work of Kazin, C-A-Z-I-N. Jean, another Jean. This one is Jean-Charles. So Jean-Charles Kazin. And he was another central figure of the Barbizon School. So right here you have the 3 major figures of the Barbizon School. So Dupree, Corot, and Kazin. And Kazin was a towering figure among that group. But this painting actually dates from 1898. By 1898, Impressionism has eclipsed the earlier moment and the earlier movement. Realism was gone by the wayside. Impressionism was now the hot ticket. And what we see here, actually, and even though Kazin is not considered an Impressionist, he's been seeing Impressionism for about 20 years. Remember, the first Impressionist show was in 1875. This is 1898. And what we have here is an Impressionist painting done by a Barbizon painter. So this is very similar to, and you'll note, actually, if you look at it, thematically it's similar to the kind of work that Claude Monet painted. So we have grain stacks in the distance, you have a house there. And if you look at the brushwork, it's an Impressionist work. So it's very different from the kind of realism that you see in this earlier generation. So he evolved with the Impressionist movement. So one of the delights of having this is we can actually show students how, in fact, painting evolves over the course, French painting evolves over the course of the end of the 19th century. So, and it's nice to kind of end the selection, these paintings, these 9 works that we got from the Clark collection, with the turn of the century. Because after 1898, the world will be completely different as we go down the abstract, non-objective path. So, that's it for my part of the conversation. Are there questions out there? I see a hand going up. Yeah.
Who painted the picture of Clark or is it a photo?
The portrait of William Clark. Actually, that's one of the paintings that we requested and we didn't get it. It's okay. I don't know who the artist is. I don't remember who the artist is.
And then twofold, roughly, what does it cost to restore? Like, that's huge, so.
Yes. This was, I believe, over $20,000 the restoration cost on this work.
And who did it? Well, I mean, where do you send it? Or
Yes, I did. It was done by Peter Malarkey in Seattle. Okay. And we don't have any painting conservation studios in Montana, so you either send things to Denver, or you send them to San Francisco, or you send them to Seattle, where, there might be a few individuals here and there in the state who do this, but serious work is done on the West Coast, other places. Yes, in the back there.
What happened to the Corcoran Gallery?
The Corcoran Gallery suffered a slow and steady demise. It just closed its doors, and the board finally decided to shutter it. So it was in financial bankruptcy for at least a decade. So yeah, which is too bad because it was a very nice museum.
So where did the other works go to?
The majority of them went to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and the rest went to museums and universities in the Washington, D.C. area. So Georgetown University, a few others, or their university museums in most cases.
So you said that he had an expert that was picking these out for him, but then the Met refused them. So what if one were to speculate, what was it that made them refuse to show these at the time?
This is all speculative at this point, but there are, the phrase uneven has been around for about 100 years in discussions of this collection. So it's possible that the Met curators, who were snobs of the highest order, looked at this collection and they said, this is uneven. But it could also be that, I suspect that there were social problems there more than anything else. It wasn't, he had reputable galleries, he bought from reputable galleries, and he had reputable individuals or critics giving him advice, art historians or curators telling him buy this, don't buy that, or whatever. So it wasn't on the merits of the work alone. So I suspect there were other reasons there for the rejection. But they could have been just purely practical. We don't want to take on, 1,000 works, and we certainly don't want to take on that house, or we don't want to take on, the responsibility. And by the way, I just learned this recently, because I've only been a museum director for 2 years, but, a donation is a wonderful thing, right? But I've stopped seeing a donation as just a pure asset. I'm now seeing it more as a responsibility, maybe even a liability. So every work you take in brings you both of those conditions. And maybe that's what maybe they just made a very practical decision. Yes?
Are the other frames originals?
Let's see. This is original. Actually, you can tell because there's all this soot and nicotine on them. You can imagine that there was a lot of smoking of cigars that took place in these galleries. But yeah, this is an original frame. That is not. That's been reframed. That one has been reframed. The Gainsborough is in its original frame. This is an original frame, and the Fragonard has been reframed. And you can tell some of these are the frames themselves are quite brittle, so this is why we don't want you close to them. Don't breathe on the work, don't scratch or pick at the work, and do not lick the painting. Okay.
Millions of dollars.
Yeah, so I'd say about half of them are original frames. And we have the original frames. At some point, we'll have those restored, and these paintings will go back into. This is a fine frame, and my good friends built it, so there's no problem. See, I can touch this frame. But this is a modern frame, okay? And eventually, I'd like to put this painting back in its original 19th century French frame. It looks more like this, only multiplied by 10. Yeah. But there are frame conservators as well, and they charge you a pretty penny to clean and redo the plaster and the gilding. Yes, you had a question?
What kinds of works of art were in the Butte Mansion?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't really know. Where are the mansion people? Oh no, you're Chateau. Yes, sorry. I don't know what was in the house. It's possible that some of this work was there, but my impression is that most of the stuff came from New York City. So, yeah, I don't know.
If I could have found out from my father, he would have been able to tell me. He worked in the mansion when he was in high school.
I don't know what's there currently that might date back to William Clark. Good question. Yes.
So when he was having these scouts out looking for the was this whole painting thing and art thing to be accepted, or was he really interested in the art and how it was done and who they were, or was it just a prestige thing for him?
That's a wonderful question. So the question is, was this all about the hubris or the prestige, the social status? I mean, I'm not a specialist here. I'm not a scholar on William Clark. And I think this is why we need to kind of reevaluate him, because we have to look carefully at what motivated his collecting. I mean, in the absence of having letters where he says, I'm collecting for these reasons, we're really speculating. I think that, there's been a general sense of maligning him for his collecting, and I don't know that that's fair. I think we need a fuller, more interesting, and a much more careful observation about what he collected and why he collected it. I see the collection as not necessarily uneven. I see it as much more coherent than that. His interests were more coherent, and I actually think he liked art.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, he would not have amassed his collection. He would not have displayed it. He would not have put so much money into it.
But
If
what
he-
was that force that they didn't like him, they didn't want him? I mean, it's like, he was, well, maybe, but it's like, was he trying to force his way into these things, or was it just done out of love and interest? I mean, I don't know,
Well-
there's two conflicts going on there.
They're clearly, if you're going to be social climbing in that age, the Gilded Age, right, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, you have to show your creds, your credentials, right? And one of those is to be well educated, right? To love good music, to love good wine, to love art. So, otherwise you were just another Marcus Daly, right? You're just another Philistine. So in some ways he had to prove himself. Yeah. So he might have been motivated by all the social pressures to be better respected. Actually, I just recently, last year during the pandemic, I visited the Ringling family place in Sarasota, and talk about ostracism. I mean, because what he did, what the Ringling family did, was so déclassé, right? Nobody accepted those people. And Ringling was also building mansions and filling them with great art and tapestries and Chinese urns and stuff, to prove that he belonged in that stratum of society. Never made it either. Actually had the worst time than Clark. It was a tough age. I mean, you guys have all seen the movie, right? The Titanic? Tough time to be a millionaire. So sad. Yes, I'll come back to you.
Do you think that, you mentioned that a lot of the works don't have any provenance, and that the Corrots had a lot of forgeries. Do you think that it's possible that the lack of provenance is why he was rejected by the Met?
It's possible, yeah, for
And
certain.
And do you think that any of these could potentially be fake?
Yes, the answer is yes, of course. And the conservative answer is to say any of this work could in fact be fake. Except for the one that has clear provenance, that, the sales records, right? This is owned by so-and-so, sold to so-and-so, sold. Yeah, for sure, any one of them could. 2 of the Corrots have been questioned in terms of their authenticity. One scholar said, well, Corot did some flecking, but it was not a typical thing, therefore this painting can't be by him. It's probably a follower or whatever, but maybe it's one of the ones where he flecked, right? So, and again, let me just say, the people who critique or criticize the two Corrots and question the authenticity of the works weren't necessarily saying these are not good paintings from the 19th century. They're just not by Corot. They're probably one of his pupils, studio assistants. And in one case, they actually said, oh, no, this is not Corot, this is Toubier, another one of the members of the Barbizon school. So what we have to do now is we have to start digging into the records, comparing these works with others. And by the way, the people who made those claims or those attributions were connoisseurs, meaning that they were basically guessing themselves. They weren't necessarily doing the research and digging up the documents and proving that this was by him or not by him. They were just saying, it looks to me like that might not be Corot. If you read the documents, you go, oh, come on, that's just some dude saying it. So anyway, there is a science behind this. I mean, and so we're gonna put an army of art historians on every one of these works in the next decade to research all of them. Because we want them all to be $1 million paintings, don't we?
Yeah.
Yes, you have a question.
I noticed all of these are very muted and dark, even though they're out in nature. Are there painters from, or artists, not painters, from the Barbizon period where outside is brighter?
Yeah, there are, certainly. But that's a great observation. What happens to painting from here to Monet is things get a lot brighter, a lot sunnier, there's just this vivacity by the time you get to the Impressionists that is really crazy. It's almost like they discover the sun. It's like, oh, these pasty people who work in the dark, discover the sun. Yeah, in general, that's definitely true. But there's also another interesting thing that happens, commercial pigments. This is early in the 19th century. The pigments are all hand ground. They're done in apothecary stores or shops or whatever. Eventually, they'll start producing commercial pigments, which were much, much brighter, and the artists go bonkers when they get these like right out of the tube kind of colors. So yeah, in general. There is another thing, and I just introduced one of my students to the term corpuscular. The Barbizon School loved to paint at those times of day when the light shifts, it changes. You know, Monet would start the day early in the morning. Let's say he's painting on the river. He has his boat. He has 6 canvases started on that boat. And he does this scene here, and he does this scene here, and he does it. 3 hours later, he's gone all the way around and done his canvases. But what's happened to the light in those 3 hours? It's changed, right? So everyone is recording a different moment in the daytime. That started with these people, and they loved the transitional times. So they loved like evening light. They loved crepuscular light, right? That kind of interesting light. So, yeah, in general, you see sometimes early light or late in the day kind of light. But the Impressionists loved all light in all times, in all weather. Yes?
So, if you look at the fine art world today, it seems to me that Lloyd's and Sotheby's and these huge auction houses influence the value of the work in a certain way. I mean, if Banksy could go for $10 million,
Bazillions, yeah.
Let's get the spray can. So, when do those auction houses start to appear? I mean, when does that happen?
There have always been influencers in the art world.
Right.
And the first ones were professors at the Royal Academy talking, whispering in the ear of the king and saying, you must buy that painting. So there have always been influencers. The market as we know it, where you have a gallery, you have an opening, and you pay in the price tag, that develops in early 19th century France. And it's part of this big movement where you have all these people moving from the countryside to the city. The cities urbanize, they develop, the population, moves from an agrarian lifestyle to now an urban industrial lifestyle. Those people learn to read and write. Those people go to art openings because there is no television and no Hulu. And this is entertainment for the masses, and therefore the gallery industry develops as a result of that. So we're talking 1830s, 1840s. You start seeing like houses, which and there have always been antiquarians in Europe going back to the 15th century, but it really takes off as a kind of art market in big cities like Berlin and Munich and in Paris in early in the 19th century. So it's part of the industrialization. It's part of like changing demographics. It's part of this trend of people becoming much more savvy about works of art and collecting them. And also, back to the question from over here, it's also about status. People shop for these things because they increase their social standing. And you've got a lot of mobility in this century. People whose grandparents were peasants now are moguls or shopkeepers who can afford beautiful paintings hanging in their houses. So the galleries were responding to that need among this rising tide of people becoming educated about art. Yes?
You mentioned provenance. Evidently, today's provenance makes a real value to those. Back in the day of William Clark, he's got 19,000 pieces in his collection. How detailed was he in terms of documentation? And was it important back then as it was today?
Well, I can just tell you about this work because I just spent the last week looking at these documents. The documentation from the Corcoran is very good. And I mean, they did, they assessed every painting. They actually invested money in restoring a lot of the works in 1925, 1926, 27. A lot of these paintings were treated, some of them were reframed then in 25, but the documents before that, who knows? So there's only a couple of bits and pieces of Clark material in those folders, and the Corcoran just gave us their files on each of these works.
Are Briggs and the others the same level of documentation?
No way. J.P. Morgan was assiduous about keeping documents. So letters, correspondence, contracts, all that stuff is in at the New York Public Library, the Morgan collection, or whatever. Yeah. We have fewer things related to Clark's collection.
Where's the Morgan collection and where is the museum in Missoula?
The Montana Museum of Art and Culture is in the PART TV Center on campus. The PARTV Center, so that's where the broadcasting station is, where the big theater is on campus. And hopefully we won't be there for too long. So we're gonna be building a
About the
building soon.
Morgan collection.
Morgan is in New York City, so there's a great deal of Morgan materials at the New York Public Library because he was a big benefactor. He was like their big benefactor, and so there's a couple of institutions in New York that have Morgan's stuff.
You're the only ones, the library and.
I think there's a couple of houses.
Yeah, there is a couple of houses.
There's a couple of houses, you know, related to the Morgans. One in Newport, if I remember correctly.
Oh, really?
I don't remember.
But I visited the Morgan House
In New York City.
in New York City. So that's a collection, it was a series of active drawings by Michelangelo. I was there.
I don't know how we're doing for time. It's,
How are we doing for time? We're doing fine with time. So, yeah. I think
here, there's a question.
Based on her question about the darkness of a lot of these paintings, and looking back at the house with what must be big electric lights hanging there, what was the difference in what these paintings appeared like 100 years ago than what they do in room lit like this?
Yeah, and that's a wonderful, wonderful question. Actually, and I didn't finish the answer to the question about lightness. The other problem is varnish. Varnish darkens over time. So if you look at the photos there, I don't know how many of those paintings were actually cleaned. Many of them had the original varnish from the 17th century. So by the time Clark bought them, they were 200-year-old varnishes. And this is what typically happened to a painting. It would be varnished the first time, and then it would start to darken. It would start getting dusty on it, you know. And so the treatment for a dusty painting that has lost its brightness was to add another layer of varnish, right? And then 50 years later, that has darkened some more. So what do? Add another layer of varnish to brighten it up a little, right? And so what you've got is you've got these accretions of layer upon layer upon layer of varnishes, each of them darkening at its own rate. And by the time you're done, you get mud, right? I mean, look at that. I mean, it was really, it was like chocolate on the surface of this. So varnishes, fortunately, can be stripped, can be removed sensitively. This has a very thin coat of varnish on it. But this will also age and darken over time. So by the time they got to Clark, a lot of the paintings were already darkened. A lot of the correspondence of the Corcoran in the late 20s were cleaning these paintings, were cleaning the varnish because you couldn't read them, you couldn't see them.
And how do you do that?
With Q-tips.
Very careful.
Very carefully, yeah. Usually it's just very, very simple solvents, not terribly complex chemically. And of course, you have to be careful, and you do it microscopically. You work in, basically, a conservator will work on, 1 square inch, over a week's course of time, depending on, on what they're cleaning. A lot of research has to go in on the work itself, and then the chemistry of it, and then they go to work. And sometimes it can take, up to a year to clean a painting like this. Question?
So, all but 9 pieces are in Washington DC?
In the DC area, yeah.
So how did you get a hold of the 9? How did that come about?
Actually, there's a woman in Missoula named Nancy Matthews who was a trustee of the Corcoran Gallery. And so she was aware that they would be dissolving and that the collection would be dispersed. And she felt that, that Clark should come back to Montana. And really, she's the person who's responsible for bringing this work back. And so the collections committee at the museum got together, and we wrote to the Corcoran, to the trustees, and we made a request that we be considered in the gifting of the collection, and they said yes. They thought it was a good idea. So I'm only here because of a lot of guilt in bringing this stuff to Butte.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, have a glass of wine. And if any of you want to write the trustees of the Corcoran and ask for more, please do.
Rafael,